Over the past couple of decades, PlayStation has become a household name. Ever since the introduction of the PlayStation 1, Sony has pretty much been on top of the gaming market. But how did they manage to do this with even their first console? And what did they do to keep hold of that top spot? To answer those questions, we need to go all the way back to where it all started in 1988? Damn. Sony engineer Ken Kutaragi, also known as the father of PlayStation, wanted to start working on video games after seeing his daughter play games on the Super Nintendo. Hence, he proposed to create a CD add-on for this console. He expected CDs would overtake cartridges and saw this as a great opportunity for Nintendo. After finding support from Sony's company president Norio Oga, Kutaragi pitched his idea with Nintendo. The company wasn't all too interested at first, but eventually allowed Kutaragi and Sony to design the add-on, as well as a console that had a cartridge slot and the CD drive built in. This console, which never made it past the prototype phase, is now known as the Nintendo PlayStation. Nintendo, however, saw that under the agreement with Sony, they didn't get a lot of profit out of it, so they decided to backstab Sony and partnered with Philips under a more lucrative contract. Because of this, Sony turned towards Sega for a partnership, but was eventually turned down as well, because according to Sega, Sony knew too little about the industry. Because of course Sega is the most qualified company to make such claims. Afterwards, Sony and Nintendo were still negotiating about the Nintendo PlayStation. Kutaragi, however, argued that a deal with Nintendo would never work and was confident that Sony would be able to create their own console. And him and Norio Oga, who had supported him through all these years, decided to sever all ties with Nintendo in 1992, and the development of the original PlayStation began. After the project got the green light and development continued, Sony had to find developers to create games for the system, since they didn't have any in-house developers yet. So they pitched their idea with hundreds of developers and got the support of many of them. One of the big reasons for this was the fact that the PlayStation was to use CDs. This meant it was a lot easier and cheaper to manufacture games for it compared to the cartridge-based consoles at the time. Sony also didn't favor its own products over third-party ones, unlike Nintendo, which prioritized their own games. On top of that, Sony gave a lot more flexibility to the developers and made it as easy as possible for them to develop for the console, leaving Sony with an enormous amount of third-party developers like EA, Ubisoft, and even Squaresoft, which before was closely linked with Nintendo. Oh yeah, and the PS1 could also play music CDs. Not only that, its marketing was brilliant as well. Before the PlayStation launched in North America and Europe, Sony presented their console at E3 1995. Sega was also present and announced that their new Saturn console would be released immediately at $399. Sony was next to present, and well, this is what happened.
$299.
God, I need a PlayStation. Needless to say, the PlayStation became a giant success right from the start. It absolutely dominated Sega. In the first 2 days of its release in North America, it sold as many systems as the Saturn sold in 5 months, and kept outselling it for all of its lifespan. When the Nintendo 64 released in 1996, the PlayStation did see some competition, mainly in the period just after the release of the 64. But because Sony had way more developers behind it and could pump out games like it was nothing, and because the PlayStation was cheaper than the Nintendo 64, Sony ultimately dominated Nintendo as well. After releasing new controllers and a new model called the PlayStation 1, the PlayStation would go on to be the first console to sell over 100 million units, completely leaving Nintendo and Sega in the dust with around 33 and 9 million units sold respectively. And Nintendo, of course, felt that one. Now, how did Sony follow up their success of creating, at the time, the most sold console of all time? By creating the current most sold console of all time, of course. After releasing the PS1, Kutaragi pretty much instantly started working on the next console. In 1997, the press was already reporting a new PlayStation was in development and would include backwards compatibility with the PS1, a DVD player, and internet connectivity. When the console launched in March 2000, the internet connectivity wasn't built in with the system anymore, but it still had the means to play DVDs and PS1 games. This was an incredibly smart move by Sony, because this would mean that the market for the PS2 was huge. On top of that, on launch, the console would only cost $299, which was cheaper than most standalone DVD players at the time. This made the PS2 a no-brainer to buy, because you could play DVDs and games. Heck, my dad even bought his PS2 because of this, and he even got this remote Sony made so you didn't have to use a controller. The backwards compatibility also meant that people could play their old games, making the PS2 even more useful at launch. When it came to the games at launch, Sony had an acceptable start. Tekken and Ridge Racer, which were some of the most beloved PS1 franchises, got a new game right at the launch of the PS2, immediately strengthening its position. When Gran Turismo 3 launched, a sequel to the most sold game on PS1, a couple months later, the lineup of PlayStation games was looking stronger and became even better around the holiday season of 2001. Sega had released their Dreamcast 1 year prior to the PlayStation 2 as a last-ditch attempt to stay in the industry after the Saturn flopped. They actually had quite a bit of success in the first year, but after the PS2 hit the market, Sega got more and more financial problems and realized it couldn't keep up the fight against Sony. And so in March 2001, they announced the Dreamcast would be discontinued. The company that initially refused to work together with Sony because of its lack of experience in the industry was forced to quit console manufacturing because of Sony only a decade after the refusal. Sega retiring from console manufacturing meant that the PS2 was the only 6th-gen console on the market for a while, and the competition from Nintendo and newly established competitor Microsoft only came in late 2001. This meant the PS2 already had a huge install base over its competitors. Because of this, its native DVD support, later added online capabilities, and a whole lot of amazing games including Ratchet & Clank, Metal Gear Solid and God of War, PlayStation managed to absolutely destroy its competition, outselling the GameCube and the Xbox combined by over 100 million units. Absolutely insane. But how about handhelds? In 2004, Sony dipped their toes in the handheld market of the gaming industry. They had already released a tiny little handheld only in Japan called the Pocket Station in 1999, but in 2004 their first serious handheld called the PlayStation Portable released. It was meant to challenge Nintendo's dominance on the handheld side. Its main competitor was Nintendo's DS, which eventually outsold the PSP by quite a significant margin. Even so, Sony's first attempt at a handheld can be seen as a great success, selling over 80 million units throughout its lifespan. This was mostly due to the fact that it was quite a different system than the DS, focusing on PS2-like graphics and multimedia purposes. The target audience was therefore quite different to Nintendo's, which consisted of casual gamers for a big part. Hence, the DS sold a lot more. But still, you can't beat that PSP marketing.
PSP. It's like a nut you can play with outside.
Yes, this is real. Back at the home consoles, it was time for the switch from standard definition to high definition gaming. How did Sony fare in this transition? Upon release of the PlayStation 3 in 2006, Sony was at quite a disadvantage. A year earlier, Microsoft had already made the jump to HD gaming with the Xbox 360, which meant they had a pretty decent head start on Sony. Nintendo had decided to try and appeal to a more casual audience, like with their handhelds, and introduced the Wii. This would go on to be the winner of this console generation. But this console, of course, was quite different to the PS3, and for that reason might not have been direct competition for it. The real battle was with Xbox this time, and Sony had a lot of catching up to do. On launch, the PS3 costed a whopping $500 to $600, depending on what model you chose, with the Xbox only costing $400. The high price of the PS3 was mostly due to the fact that a whole lot of features were thrown into the console, like for instance a Blu-ray player and backwards compatibility for PS1 and PS2 games. All these features meant that Sony actually lost money on the system in the first years. Fortunately for Sony, they found a way to cut production costs, and the console started to turn profitable by late 2008. Microsoft was steadily growing their sales at this point and were still quite far ahead of Sony. When Sony introduced their second model of the PS3, called the PS3 Slim, and went through a full-on rebranding in 2009, they started to gain ground. The Slim model dropped PS2 backwards compatibility, but got a lot smaller and got a ton of quality of life improvements. The console sales got a huge boost, and Sony was getting closer and closer to Microsoft. It also helped that Blu-ray discs would become the new standard for movies around this time. The Xbox had an HD DVD adapter, which competed with Blu-ray. But the PS3, of course, had a Blu-ray player built in. One more reason to get the PS3 over the Xbox 360. In 2012, Sony released the final iteration of their console called the PS3 Super Slim. This model was even cheaper than the Slim model and was therefore received pretty well too. The games for the console had also racked up a lot over these years. Most notable were the Little Big Planet series, the Uncharted franchise, Metal Gear Solid 4, and saving the best for last, The Last of Us, releasing a couple of months before the launch of the PlayStation 4, boosting sales one last time before the next generation arrived. After all of the revisions and the great games they put out, Sony still managed to overtake Microsoft in sales. Although Sony had a really poor start to the generation, their innovation and smart decisions around the marketing and branding caused them to still create the best-selling HD console of the generation. But they just had to f*** up their handhelds. The PlayStation Vita that launched in 2011 as a follow-up to the PSP just had too much working against it. Though the games on the platform looked really good for a handheld, the games were of varying quality. On top of that, the introduction of smartphone gaming meant that handhelds as a whole were starting to become less and less popular. Many found the Vita to be quite underwhelming. This meant the Vita did not perform as Sony had hoped, selling only around 16 million units, compared to the 80 million PSP units sold. But of course, if a high quality handheld that still sold quite a bit is your biggest mistake, it could be a lot worse. Oh, for God's sake. Yeah, Sony also released the PlayStation TV a day before their next mainline home console. What the hell is a PlayStation TV, you may ask? Well, it's a streaming box wannabe that plays PlayStation Vita games for $99 on release. Doesn't sound like a bad deal, right? Until you realize it's only compatible with a handful of Vita games, and you can't use streaming apps like Netflix. Yeah, this thing ended up in a lot of clearance bins, and is definitely something Sony would like you to forget. Some hackers found a way to increase the amount of games you could play on it, which made it a pretty cool little console, but everything Sony initially did to it completely backfired. A day after the release of their little fuck-up, Sony released their new home console for the 7th generation, the PS4. With Microsoft screwing up the marketing of their new console, mostly focusing on multimedia possibilities, and the Wii U, well, being the Wii U, the stage was set for Sony to dominate the console wars once more. But did they? Let's start on launch, where the marketing of PlayStation looks something like this. God, I need a PlayStation again. On top of that, the controller was very much improved over the PS3, the console was more powerful than the Xbox One, and costed $100 less. Do you see where this is going? Sony left Microsoft in the dust in the first couple of years after launch, selling over 50 million units in about 4 years. Considering the Xbox One sold that throughout its entire lifespan, says enough about how good the PS4 actually was. And if you wanted good games, boy oh boy was the PS4 the system for you. Just to name a few of the exclusives: Uncharted 4, God of War, Spider-Man, Last of Us Part 2, Persona 5, Detroit Become Human, Horizon Zero Dawn. There were just so many of them. This is arguably PlayStation's strongest generation when it comes to exclusives, and considering it already had some great exclusives before this, that's an insane feat. At this point, the games you'd buy an Xbox for were Halo and Forza. Yeah, no wonder the PS4 won this generation. A total of 116 million units have been sold to date, making the PS4 Sony's second best-selling console. And the number might even increase somewhat, because the PS4 is still being sold as a budget gaming system today. But where do we go from here? Since 2020, the PS5 is Sony's main console, and ever since its release, it's been very desired. Everyone wanted one, and Sony just didn't have enough units for everybody. Now the craze has settled down a bit, but the aftermath is kind of ridiculous. The PS5 has already sold over 52 million units, almost doubling the Xbox Series X and S sales. And looking at it now, I think that difference will only be getting bigger and bigger. And now that Microsoft is going to be putting some of their very few exclusives out on PS5 and Switch as well, I think the console industry might even be turning into a two-man game again. But of course, we can't be certain about any of that. What we can be certain of is that Sony has built an amazing legacy with its PlayStation brand, hitting the ground running in the 90s and still having all of the hype surrounding the brand today. And what once was an underdog failing to work together with the big boys is now one of the most respected and successful companies in video game history. But now you know about one of the best console manufacturers, you might also want to find out what the best controller of all time is by clicking this video right here.